Paul Ray will speak first. He is professor of history and political science at Hillsdale College, where he holds the Charles O. Lee and Louise K. Lee Chair in the Western Heritage. Prior to that, he spent many years at the University of Tulsa, where he was the J.P. Walker Professor of History. He completed a PhD in ancient history at Yale University under the direction of Donald Kagan in 1977, and was a Rhodes Scholar from 1971 to 1974. He has published dozens of articles in scholarly journals and is the author of many great books. Following Professor Ray's remarks, we will hear from James Caesar, who is professor of politics at the University of Virginia, where he has taught since 1976. Professor Caesar has written several books on American politics and political thought, including Presidential Selection, Liberal Democracy and Political Science, Reconstructing America, and Nature and History in American Political Development. He is a frequent contributor to the popular press and often comments on American politics for the Voice of America. Finally, we will hear from Thomas West, who is professor of politics at the University of Dallas, where he has taught since 1974. Professor West is also a director and senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, and he received his PhD from Claremont Graduate University in 1974. He was Bradley Resident Scholar here at the Heritage Foundation from 1988 to 1989, and Salvatori Visiting Scholar at Claremont McKenna College from 1990 to 1992. He is the author of the excellent and important book, Vindicating the Founders, Race, Sex, Class, and Justice in the Origins of America. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for putting on this particular event. I want to frame my discussion of Tocqueville by thinking a little bit about contemporary politics, and then suggest the significance of what Tocqueville has to teach for our particular situation in 2009. Conservatism in America is now at a nadir, but there's some hope, or you wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be here, that it might recover. What would happen if it were to recover? In particular, what would happen if the Republicans were to make a dramatic comeback, as they did in 1938, 1966, and 1994? And now 3 months ago, this would have seemed a complete pipe dream, and maybe it really still is. But as the Obama administration flounders and the president's negatives rise slowly, but I think inexorably, the Republicans ride higher in the polls, and Democratic senators from toss-up states begin to display anxiety, such a scenario seems conceivable. Thus far, the Republicans have been tactically adept, and we can foresee the possibility, at least, maybe not the probability, but the possibility that they will stick to their guns and refuse to become what they were before 1980, tax collectors for the welfare state. This is, however, the easy part, opposition. And there is no sign that anyone has given any serious thought to developing a coherent program for governance. In the absence of such a strategy, in the absence of a plan, as became evident almost immediately after Newt Gingrich resigned his post as Speaker of the House, the Republicans will wander more or less aimlessly. Before we contemplate the future, however, we must confront an exceedingly unpleasant fact. For nearly a century now, the Friends of Liberty, local autonomy, and civic agency have been in retreat, and the administrative state has grown by leaps and bounds. The ideological foundation for this development was laid during the presidential campaign of 1912, when both Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt attacked the Constitution. And William Howard Taft, its only defender, came in a dismal third. The institutional foundation was put in place 1 year later with the ratification of the 16th and 17th Amendments to the Constitution, which legalized the federal income tax and provided for the direct election of United States senators, putting the federal government in a position to secure for itself unlimited funding and denying to the state legislatures, which had once chosen the senators, the capacity to defend state and local governments against federal encroachment. Since that time, since 1913, without a respite, the conservatives have been giving ground, sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly. And the advocates of centralized administration have gradually extended their tentacles into nearly every corner of American public and private life. Moreover, since 1928, the only real difference between Republicans and Democrats has been the pace. Herbert Hoover, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, George Herbert Walker Bush, and George W. Bush may not have been as enthusiastic about extending federal powers as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Barack Obama, but they were nonetheless quite assiduous. Even under Ronald Reagan, the only recent president who made it a concerted attempt to limit the growth of the federal government, that government nonetheless extended its reach. Of course, the localities and the states still exist. Elections take place. There are school boards, town, city, county, and state governments, and they still matter some. Even if on a growing and great variety of subjects, they take their orders from a national government that offers them vast sums of money in funding in return for strict compliance with its every whim. Our polity is a hodgepodge, but with every passing year, the burden of federal regulation becomes more intolerable, and the number of mandates with increasing rapidity grows. Moreover, nearly all of the regulations imposed are devised by unelected civil servants and political appointees to whom Congress, undeniably in breach of the Constitution's separation of powers, has delegated legislative, executive, and judicial responsibilities. And next to nothing with regard to these is examined and voted on by elected officials who can be held responsible by the voting public for the consequences of what has been done. Moreover, what remains undecided within the administrative agencies is generally dealt with in courts, unresponsive to the electorate. We may take a pride still in being a self-governing people, but to an ever-increasing degree, that pretense is unsustainable. If we're ever to put a stop to the advance of the administrative state, and even roll it back, if we are ever to recover the liberty that once was ours, and reassert our dignity as citizens rather than as clients and as subjects, we must first come to understand what it is that has occasioned central administration's seemingly inexorable march. Here I would argue Alexis de Tocqueville, who died 150 years ago on 16 April 1859, is our best guide. For what he feared with regard to his native France is increasingly true for the United States. We have contracted the French disease. To an ever-increasing degree, our compatriots are subject to what he described as an immense tutelary power, which takes sole charge of assuring their enjoyment and of watching over their fate. As he predicted, this power is absolute, attentive to detail, regular, provident, and gentle, and it works willingly for their happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their needs, guides them in their principal affairs, directs their industry, regulates their testaments, divides their inheritances. It is entirely proper to ask whether it can relieve them entirely of the trouble of thinking and of the effort associated with living, for such is evidently its aim. Moreover, after having taken each individual in this fashion by turns into its powerful hands, and after having kneaded him in accord with its desires, the sovereign extends its arms about society as a whole. It covers its surface with a network of petty regulations, complicated, minute, and uniform, through which even the most original minds and the most vigorous souls know not how to make their way past the crowd and emerge into the light of day. It does not break wills, it softens them, bends them, and directs them. Rarely does it force one to act, but it constantly opposes itself to one's acting on one's own. It does not destroy, It prevents things from being born. It extinguishes. It stupefies. And finally, he predicted, it will reduce each nation to nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. As I said, when Tocqueville wrote these words, he did not have our country in mind. He was worried, and rightly so, about his native France, where other luminaries, such as François Guizot, looked forward to the rule of a technocratic elite armed with authority conferred by a liberal quasi-democratic regime. Tocqueville anticipated something much more ominous, the establishment of a social body that would be intent on exercising foresight with regard to everything, that would act as a second providence, nourishing men from birth and protecting them from perils, and that would function as a tutelary power capable of rendering men gentle and sociable in such a manner that crimes would become rare and virtues as well. For when, under the rule of this tutelary power, he foresaw that the human soul would enter a long repose, in the process, individual energy would be almost extinguished, and when action was required, men would rely on others. In effect, a peculiar brand of what he called egoism initially and individualism later would reign, for everyone would draw into himself. If fanaticism disappeared, he wrote, so would convictions and beliefs and human agency itself. The new and unprecedented species of servitude that Tocqueville had in mind was, as he later observed, regulated, gentle, or soft, and favorable to peace. He suspected that it could be combined more easily than men were inclined to imagine with some of the external forms of liberty. He even suggests that it would be possible for it to be established in the very shadow of the sovereignty of the people. In this fashion, with the institutions of a unitary, tutelary, all-powerful government elected by the citizens at regular intervals, one might actually satisfy the two contradictory impulses found among his contemporaries, the felt need for guidance and the longing to remain free. What this would involve, Tocqueville explains, is a species of compromise between administrative despotism and the sovereignty of the people, a corrupt bargain between the ghost of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and that of his erstwhile admirer Henri Robert Jacques Turgot, in which the political doctrine of Rousseau is deployed rhetorically for the purpose of legitimizing a law-abiding, steady, reliable despotism on the Chinese model, of the sort that was espoused in full knowledge of what they were embracing by Turgot's mentors among the physiocrats in France. Under such an arrangement, Tocqueville remarked, the citizens emerged for a brief moment from dependence for the purpose of indicating their masters, and then re-enter without further ado their former state of dependence. They console themselves for being in tutelage with the thought that they have chosen the tutors themselves, and they think that they have sufficiently guaranteed the liberty of the individual when they have delivered it to the national power. This was the fear that brought Tocqueville to North America, that the great democratic revolution sweeping the globe would eventuate in liberty, or not in liberty, but in a soft, gentle despotism wholly welcome to those who would be subject to it. He came to our shores, hoping against hope, that he would discover in our country an antidote to the process that had in France produced a Napoleon and that seemed likely to eventuate in something far less impressive than the great Bonaparte. He always had in mind his nephew, Louis Napoleon. And here on these shores, Tocqueville discovered what he was looking for. In decentralized administration, in local self-government, civic associations, an unfettered press, biblical religion, and in the marital solidarity characteristic of Jacksonian America, he found what he took to be an antidote for the soft despotism that he rightly saw as democracy's drift. Above all, he was persuaded that where there is centralized administration and individual citizens find themselves alone facing the state, they will succumb to the disposition that Pascal, Montesquieu, and Rousseau had called inquiétude, using a word that has a range of meanings that stretches from uneasiness and restlessness to anxiety and outright fear. And in search of a sense of security, he feared, in the face of that inquiétude, they would gradually become passive subjects. But he also saw that where there is considerable local autonomy, as there was in the United States, and the citizens experience civic agency and learn the art of association by participating in local self-government, where there is genuine and spirited public debate, where there are newspapers here, there, and everywhere, where the citizens find in biblical religion a moral anchor and a foundation for a sense of their own dignity, a kind of pride in being human beings and in exercising their free wills, and where they are sustained by domestic tranquility typifying their home lives, the sense of inquietude typical of liberal democratic man will give way to a trust in their own capacities, and they will be likely to be anything but passive and to have the confidence to join together and face down officials intent on lording it over them. He would have loved yesterday's tea parties. One cannot read Tocqueville's description of democracy in America with equanimity, however. For as I've already intimated, to a considerable extent, the world that he described in that book is lost. The states and localities are enthralled to the federal government. Civic associations survive almost solely as lobbying operations. Newspapers are disappearing hither and yon. Christianity and Judaism have lost their hold on much of our population. The divorce rate is unbelievably high, and last year 40% of all children in the United States were born out of wedlock. We cannot continue on the path we now tread and sustain a genuine democracy. Of course, this is not the first time that the American regime has faced a great crisis. We did so once before, in and before the 1860s. And at a terrible cost, we managed to weather that crisis by attending to the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, put into practical form through the Constitution, and given an authoritative interpretation in the Federalist. Tocqueville was not entirely oblivious to this first crisis when he published Democracy in America, but he did not fully appreciate it in the 1830s. He had planned to sojourn on his journey through America in Charleston, South Carolina, for a period of 6 weeks. But his travels in North America were cut short by orders from France. Had he gone to Charleston, South Carolina in the 1830s, in the early 1830s, as he planned, he would have realized that the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which he had heard read out on the 4th of July in Albany, New York, were under assault in another corner of the country. It was not until later, as evidenced by his letters, especially those written in 1850 and 1851 when he was foreign minister of France, they were published 2 weeks ago, by the way, that he came fully to appreciate the danger. We can learn something about the problem from reading Democracy in America, but Americans in the 1840s and in the 1850s had no real need of Tocqueville's guidance. What was at issue was clear enough, and the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Federalist were a sufficient guide. What was required was simply a reassertion of American principles. The second crisis, our crisis, the second crisis of the American regime is of a different character. It had its origins in the 1870s and in the 1880s in the most unlikely of places, among the political offspring of Abraham Lincoln in the bowels of the Republican Party. It began with that party, within the liberal wing of evangelical Christianity, and it had its initial home in the universities. It is the first political movement in American history to owe something to universities. Its proponents called themselves progressives. They inhabited universities constituted on the German model. They thought of themselves as scientists exploring new frontiers. They were powerfully influenced by Hegel's phenomenology of right and by the social Darwinism inspired by Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. For Abraham Lincoln, almost without exception, the exception being Woodrow Wilson, they expressed a profound reverence. But under these influences, they abandoned as outmoded the notion asserted by the Founding Fathers and reasserted by Lincoln that the Declaration of Independence embodied self-evident truths. Under these influences, they came to see the Constitution as outmoded, and when the generation to which they belong came to exercise leadership in the fullest possible sense in 1912, they advocated jettisoning both. We do not need Tocqueville to see this apostasy as an apostasy. No one who reads the preamble to the Declaration of Independence can be comfortable with affirmative action and with intrusive bureaucracy. No one who reads the Constitution in light of the Federalist can be satisfied with our abandonment of the two great principles of self-government enshrined in that Constitution and defended in that volume, the separation of powers and federalism. Our entire tradition weighs against the administrative state, but nonetheless it has grown. It continues to grow under Republicans and Democrats alike, and right now it threatens to grow again dramatically. This is where Tocqueville comes in. Neither the Declaration of Independence nor the Constitution nor the Federalist is sufficient to enable us to understand what I call the nexus of tyrannical ambition and servile temptation. The leading documents of our tradition do not address this question, nor should they have done so. The preamble to the Declaration of Independence is a statement of first principles. It is not a fully elaborated political theory or political science. The Constitution presupposes a fully elaborated political science, and much of what it presupposes is elaborated in the Federalist. But that work was produced for an occasion. Its aim was to encourage the ratification of the Constitution. Its aim was to make the case for a national government in addition to the state governments, and therefore it was a kind of critique of local government. Its authors hoped thereby to form a more perfect union. As a statement of political science, it was of necessity incomplete because of the occasion to which it was directed. If the founders understood the nexus of tyrannical ambition and servile temptation, and one of them certainly did, and I have Thomas Jefferson in mind, they quite properly refrained from addressing it in the Federalist. This is why we need Tocqueville today. As his letters reveal, he came to America with a fully worked out account of the nexus of tyrannical ambition and servile temptation. He did not learn about democracy in America. In America, he learned about democracy in America, that is to say, about a particular example of democracy. What he looked for in these parts and found was a regime equipped with the means to resist servile temptation and tyrannical ambition. His is not a book primarily about the American regime. It is a book about democracy. And he uses our regime solely as an example. He wrote in French for a French audience. His aim was to instruct them in what they needed to know. He had no need to mention the Declaration of Independence. First principles were not germane to his task. The French, after all, had their own declaration, and it too embodied the principle that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. This principle he took for granted, and he alluded to its implications, for example, in discussing slavery, in much the same fashion as did the Federalist, which also does not explicitly mention the Declaration of Independence. You need to think about Tocqueville's Democracy in America as a kind of supplement to the Federalist in that regard. Its focus is less on first principles than on political science. He did speak about the gradual discovery of the equality principle in the course of European history. And he quite rightly traced that discovery to the Christian faith, the first to talk about men being endowed by their Creator with natural rights. The first to speak about men being naturally equal are the church fathers. He rightly traced that discovery to the Christian faith and to the influence that it exercised within Europe over a multitude of centuries. But he never suggested, as some suppose, that the truth of the principle of equality was in any way historically contingent. His subject, when he talked about history and the principle of equality, was the discovery of the principle of equality. We need to read Democracy in America as Tocqueville intended that it be read, as an adjunct to the Federalists, which he frequently cites, intended to instruct the French in virtues they sorely lacked and, alas, still sorely lack, in an appreciation for the vital significance of federalism and local self-governments, the importance of civic associations and a free press, the political virtue of the Christian religion, and the necessity for familial harmony. We would not ourselves desperately need this adjunct to the Federalist had we remained true to our inheritance, had we not contracted the French disease. But now, alas, we are as much in need of Tocqueville as were the French in his own day, and we cannot understand the nexus of tyrannical ambition and servile temptation if we do not pay close attention to his account, indebted to Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws, in particular to the chapter in the Spirit of Laws, Book 19, Chapter 27, in which he describes the mores and manners of the English, and to Montesquieu's greatest student, Rousseau, of the distinctive political psychology of liberal democratic man. And Tocqueville is also indebted to Thomas Jefferson, the one American who feared the nexus of tyrannical ambition and servile temptation, and who identified local self-government, what he called ward republics, as the means by which this could be resisted. 72 years ago, in 1937, at the height of the New Deal, Walter Lippmann, a repentant progressive, noted that while the partisans who are now fighting for the mastery of the modern world wear shirts of different colors, their weapons are drawn from the same armory, their doctrines are variations of the same theme, and they go forth to battle singing the same tune with slightly different words. Throughout the world, in the name of progress, men who call themselves communists, socialists, fascists, nationalists, progressives, and even liberals, are unanimous in holding that government, with its instruments of coercion, must, by commanding the people how they shall live, direct the course of civilization and fix the shape of things to come. The premises of authoritarian collectivism have become the working beliefs, he wrote, the self-evident assumptions, the unquestioned axioms not only of all the revolutionary regimes, but of nearly every effort which lays claim to being enlightened, humane, and progressive. So universal is the domination of this dogma over the minds of contemporary men that no one is taken seriously as a statesman or a theorist who does not come forward with proposals to magnify the power of public officials and to extend and multiply their interventions in human affairs. Unless he is authoritarian and collectivist, he is a mossback, a reactionary, at best an amiable eccentric swimming hopelessly against the tide. It is a strong tide. Though despotism is no novelty in human affairs, it is probably true that at no time in 2,500 years has any Western government claimed for itself a jurisdiction over men's lives comparable with that which is officially attempted in totalitarian states. But it is even more significant, Lippmann wrote, that in other lands, where men shrink from the ruthless policy of these regimes, it is commonly assumed that the movement of events must be in the same direction. Nearly everywhere, the mark of a progressive is that he relies at last upon an increased power of officials to improve the condition of men. What worried Lippmann the most, what had worried Calvin Coolidge before him, and what should worry us even more today, was the failure of those who considered themselves progressives to remember how much of what they cherish as progressive has come by emancipation from political domination, by the limitation of power, by the release of personal energy from authority and collective coercion. Lippmann cited the whole long struggle to extricate conscience, intellect, labor, and personality from the bondage of prerogative, privilege, monopoly, authority. It was, he said, the gigantic heresy of an apostate generation to suppose that there has come into the world during this generation some new element which makes it necessary for us to undo the work of emancipation, to retrace the steps men have taken to limit the power of rulers, which compels us to believe that the way of enlightenment in affairs is now to be found by intensifying authority and enlarging its scope. It is with Lippmann's warning in mind that we should resume our attempt to understand the present discontents in light of what we can learn from Montesquieu's account of the English form of government, from Rousseau's account of commercial society, but above all else, from Alexis de Tocqueville, who saw a way to oppose Rousseau when he came to North America. And it is Alexis de Tocqueville whom we commemorate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Next we will hear from Jim Caesar.
Well, thanks, Joe, and all of our appreciation should be extended this afternoon to the Heritage Foundation for scheduling this event today to commemorate Tocqueville. And what better way to do so than to feature an important new book by Paul Ray, which will continue to enrich our understanding of Tocqueville for years to come. There are, generally speaking, two approaches that can be taken to studying Tocqueville. One is that of treating him as a political thinker or theorist and making every effort to understand his work, perhaps subjecting it to criticism. The other is to draw inspiration from him and to continue the enterprise that he launched of introducing a new political science for a new era, a political science that asks how we can maintain a functioning liberal democracy that produces a society of free men and women. Tocqueville did that for his day, but of course, that was his day. The Tocquevillian project consists of asking these questions and applying these questions, and that project should continue in our day. Just as he treated institutions, religion, media, the arts, architecture, family, in short, almost everything we find in society with a view to this question, we must do so as a political science in our time. And I think Paul Ray's study opens up fruitful avenues of both approaches to Tocqueville, both what he meant in his day and for what he could mean today, and we're doubly grateful to him for that. Now, our assignment this afternoon is to comment on Tocqueville's relationship to conservatism. Tocqueville himself could not have conceived his thought in this way because the term conservative, if it had been invented, had only been invented recently before he came to America. Burke, for example, never uses the word conservatism, although Tocqueville was very aware of Burke's thought. And as for America, Tocqueville knew and met a certain group of persons in America associated with the American Whig Party, which were conservative in a new sense, that is, conservative not in a European sense, but who embodied a new way of thinking. And Tocqueville, when we look back at him and consider him in context, was very influenced by these thinkers and in turn helped to shape the Whig Party in the United States. But as for modern American conservatism, which is a word that identifies a coalition of different bodies or strains of thought that have been joined, or some say have been joined together under one word, of course Tocqueville could have known nothing. Still, the truth is that if you took today a hopscotch of the various conservative safe houses in Washington, beginning here at Union Station and making your way uptown via Mass Avenue, and thence to the K Street corridor, and perhaps all the way up to Georgetown University, you'd find many centers and institutions that would be proud today to name Alexis de Tocqueville a senior scholar, even a distinguished senior scholar. For when it comes to the notion, say, that Americans were once, and importantly, Anglos and religious before they ever embraced natural rights philosophy, Tocqueville was Sam Huntington before Sam Huntington. And when it comes to the notion that a huge central state with a massive centralized administrative bureaucracy takes us down a road to serfdom, Tocqueville was, of course, Friedrich Hayek before Friedrich Hayek. When it comes to the idea that a robust biblical faith among the American people should have its place in the public square, Tocqueville was Richard Newhouse before Richard Newhouse. When it comes to the great cultural perspective that modern democratic civilization can flatten, debase, and diminish the human spirit, Tocqueville was Richard Weaver before Richard Weaver. when it comes to the notion that secondary powers and associations are the essential elements of a pluralistic society, he was Robert Nisbet before Robert Nisbet. On this point, Tocqueville could even be shoring up the head of the philanthropy project today at Hudson with Bill Shambra. And his book, Tocqueville's, which mentions philosophy and philanthropy, could have made him president of AEI. Tocqueville was warning against the 10-pin long before Robert Putnam had become CEO of Bowling Alone, Inc. at Harvard. And as for the idea of America as a great world power, an empire of democracy roaming and policing the world, Tocqueville was Bill Kristol before Bill Kristol. Indeed, I observed that Tocqueville even wrote a powerful editorial for the Weekly Standard a few weeks ago, for which I hope his estate was richly enumerated. Now, there may be some tensions between these various currents and strands of the conservative movement today, but they come closer to being put together into some kind of coherent whole in the thought of Tocqueville than anyone else. Tocqueville's connection with these parts of conservatism are well known, and they've been widely noted and studied, and I think they really need no further rehearsing. For this afternoon, in the brief time I have, I'd like to try to add one other perspective to viewing Tocqueville's work that I hope can open further reflection to conservative thought. At the end of the day, as I think all would agree, the final and most important criterion for analyzing and assessing different regimes is the kind or kinds of human beings that they tend to produce and promote. Even in our modern understanding of society, where the role of the political has been drawn mostly to protect our rights and our views of happiness, as distinct from earlier societies where the political responsibility went explicitly to producing specific ideas of virtue or right thought. Even today, under this modern understanding, we keep our eye on the result of our arrangement, and we would be dismayed if the product of our free societies promoted under this system, promoted human beings who were mean or odious. In fact, whether we're free or not in this sense, it's remarkable how much of our public policy discussions still connect directly or indirectly to the kinds of human beings that are produced in our societies, whether we're speaking of education policy, drug laws, rules of marriage, and even our tax code. So we can't avoid this question then of the character of human beings. Now, Tocqueville helped to give rise to a way of viewing the kinds or types of human beings produced that, as it was picked up by some others, has had some unhappy consequences, but which, in his case, I think still remains helpful. Tocqueville operates with the background conception of man or human being as such, who is fixed on a few consistent and constituent points, including, for example, some glimmer of a deep intimation that prompts every man to wonder the reason for his own existence here on earth. But on top of this idea of man as such, he proceeds, and I'll now use an analogy from opticians, he proceeds to place a set of lenses on top of the original man. These lenses powerfully shape humans into different types. The two great lenses applied in democracy in America derive from the social state connected with the historical era in which they developed. One lens placed on top of man as such and deriving from a social state of hierarchy gives us the general type called aristocratic man. The other, deriving from the social state of equality, gives us the general type called democratic man. These two general types are so dramatically different in so many important ways as to approach producing characters of a different kind or species altogether. Now, this mode of thought, the one that connects an age or era to a general type of human being, was picked up and radicalized by two of the greatest philosophers of the 19th and 20th centuries, respectively, Nietzsche and Heidegger, each of whom spoke of what amounted to a unique type for our modern epoch. The herd, or modern European in Nietzsche's sense, das Mann, or the American, you could say, in Heidegger's case. A type of such low and dismal quality as to lead each of these thinkers to suggest the need for some kind of total and complete transformation of society, radically blowing up the constitutions of the so-called civilized societies of the time. Tocqueville did not, of course, take this step. The reason is not just that he was more moderate and political, though he was, and not just that he had seen so closely the ravaging impact of an effort to tear up society to remake it, as he had through the French Revolution. It was rather that the democratic man he sketches in the end is still rather a broad type that contains a whole range of possibilities and subtypes, some of which are defensible and of defensible quality, some of which are sad and dismal. There is, in short, a third lens that Tocqueville applies on top of democratic man. These lenses yield different varieties, the choices among which make a great deal of difference, enough difference to count for any reasonable assessment of the quality of human beings and regimes. All Tocqueville scholars have noticed something like this, but I think it's time now to take what is implicit and make it explicit by giving names to each of these new types and developing more concretely their characteristics, how Tocqueville envisages them, which are worthy or helpful and which not, and how to encourage the worthy and counterbalance the dangerous ones. And just as a starting point in the few minutes that remain to me, I'll designate a couple who are on the negative side. I'd mention first global man. The psychology of global man is distinguished by the fact that his point of positive adhesion is not with anything particular, but more and more with everyone, with humanity as such. Another name for this would be the religion of humanity. This is an outgrowth of a tendency of democratic man to move away from connection to class, to the nation, but then beyond the nation and in negation of the nation to the world. It would culminate then in attachment to the notion of the world and world citizenship. And its adherents would be those who look to move the world at some point in time and who are uneasy with notions of the nation and national honor. It's clear that in their professions of belief, many Europeans are closer or have reached this point. It partly divides our own populace, falling somewhere between younger and older. The cleavage showed up in the last election, where to some of the young, while there may have been a respect for John McCain's biography, it was not quite as valued as Barack Obama's, who had a greater resonance with this notion of the religion of humanity. There is no doubt that this vast constituency of the religion of humanity worldwide strongly favored President Obama, who was, so to speak, elected by the world and counted as the first president of the world. Whether he flirts with considering himself more in this light than as a mere local hack, that is, President of the United States, has been a matter of much speculation. The stopping point, according to Tocqueville, should be the nation, which is the major unit in democratic times still capable of great action and which can still uphold the standard of honor. In other words, if the identification of man is humanity, the notion of greatness must grow dimmer and dimmer. The second and final man I'll mention is present-day man. The characteristic element of this person is the identification of a time horizon with the now, meaning my life, the time in which I live, neither a connection to a long past and only perhaps the weakest connection to the future. The development of present-day man is one of the most notable traits of our time, more in Europe perhaps than the United States. It is probably the source of the demographic collapse of large segments of modern liberal democratic societies. For without a serious horizon of the future, coming from a cause that will endure, be it a political or a religious one, or better still, a combination of those two, there's no reason to procreate for a time beyond our own. I will stop at this point, urging this departure in the study of Tocqueville, and urging conservatives to find the time and energy to understand the types and varieties of democratic man as part of the project of a new political science for a new era.
Finally, Tom West from the University of Dallas.
Thank you, Joe, and I repeat Jim Caesar's thanks to Heritage and to Joe Postel for holding this event. Tocqueville gives us many things of great value, which we have heard about from our previous two speakers. I'm going to raise questions about Tocqueville as an adequate guide for understanding America in my talk.
Paul Ray argues in his book that Tocqueville can help us understand both what pushes democracy toward despotism and what remedies can keep democracy from degenerating into tyranny. Although Tocqueville's book is indeed brilliant, I am not convinced that it is as helpful as one might wish in diagnosing the the despotic drift in which we are in the grip of. Today, I'll limit my comments to Tocqueville's misunderstanding of the founding, and therefore, I would argue, of America as such. The most striking sign of his misunderstanding of the founding is that in a 700-page book on America, Tocqueville never once mentions, let alone analyzes, the political theory of the American Revolution as articulated in the Declaration of Independence and other founding-era documents. The logic of Ray's own analysis, I believe, points to this defect in Tocqueville. Toward the end of his book, Soft Despotism, Ray turns to today's political scene. He describes the origins of today's despotic state in the ideas of progressive intellectuals, those who were active in and after the 1870s and 1880s. These men, says Ray, aimed at the foundation of a new political regime. The progressives dismissed as outdated the concern with individual natural rights shared by Jefferson, Hamilton, and Lincoln. Ray implies that the origin of today's problems is not, as Tocqueville had argued, the logic of the people's democratic passions and ideas arising from the equality of conditions. Instead, the origin seems to lie in the ideas of disgruntled intellectuals who rejected the principles of the founding and of majority rule. For all their talk of the need to make America more democratic, the progressive and later liberal hostility to local self-government reveals their true agenda. The rot came from the top down, not from the bottom up. From the anti-democratic elites, not from the people. A common complaint among progressive intellectuals a century ago was that the American people continued to be stubbornly loyal to the founders' ideas of individual rights and limited government. Today, liberals disparage people who cling to their guns, their religion, their belief in property rights, and their belief in limited government. If the progressives and today's liberals feel the need to attack the political theory of the founding, does that not imply that the natural rights theory of the founding was a significant obstacle to the liberal revolution of the 20th century? Does it not also imply that part of the remedy for today's ills might be found in a revival of the natural rights thinking that animated the founding? How then, I would ask, can Tocqueville help us? Ray admits that Tocqueville did not do full justice to the American regime because his aim was to instruct his French compatriots in what they most needed to know. Ray says that Tocqueville was not disdainful of the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, and in fact believed in them, but that since the French Revolution had impaired local self-government in France, Tocqueville did not think that the abstract doctrines of equality and liberty were what the French needed to hear. Tocqueville meant to remind the French, says Ray, of the blessings of the municipal liberties that they themselves had once enjoyed, but had lost, partly as a result of the French Revolution. But when Ray says that Tocqueville fails to do full justice to America, does he not imply that Tocqueville may not be the best guide either to understanding America or to analyzing the problems of the current movement in the West towards despotism? It really does not matter whether, as Ray argues, Tocqueville tacitly agreed with the natural rights teaching of the founders, but concealed it from his French audience for pedagogical purposes, or whether, as I suspect, Tocqueville followed his mentor Rousseau in rejecting the idea of natural law in the sense in which Locke and the founders understood it. Either way, whether he agreed tacitly or disagreed with it, Tocqueville does not tell us what America really was. there is evidence of Tocqueville's rejection of the idea of nature and natural right. In the only chapter in which he affirms the very general conception of the equal right of all at birth to liberty, he also says, in effect, that all general ideas are false. Thus, it should be no surprise when Tocqueville attributes the teaching that all men are naturally similar and equal, not to philosophers, but to Christianity. In another passage, Tocqueville speaks of justice not as a principle inherent in the natural order or discovered from an examination of the natural order, but as a law, quote, made or at least adopted by the majority of men, unquote. In other words, the idea of justice is authoritative not because it is in accord with an eternal standard of right, as the founders said, but because all men accept it. Tocqueville says he appeals here, quote, from the sovereignty of the people to the sovereignty of the human race, unquote. Mankind's general will seems then to be the source of justice. Unfortunately, Tocqueville implies that if the will of mankind should change, justice would be redefined. Cold comfort. Tocqueville's blindness to or silence on the founders' political theory reminds me of a 1996 speech of Justice Scalia. In the Q&A, Scalia was asked whether democracy requires protection of individual rights. Scalia responded, quote, "The whole theory of democracy, my dear fellow, is that the majority rules. That is the whole theory of it. You protect minorities only because the majority determines that there are certain minorities or certain minority positions that deserve protection," unquote. Tocqueville, too, presents the whole theory of democracy as being nothing more than rule of the majority. It has no internal source of self-restraint. Tocqueville rightly believes that this is a dangerous doctrine. He sees that Americans in the 1830s did not actually believe that the majority can do whatever it wants. He concludes that American democracy must have succeeded because of some historical accident. In Tocqueville's view, America became an amalgam of disparate elements, some of which turned out to be very useful in restraining the majority. These elements were a legacy of the English aristocratic past. Three of these elements of aristocratic prominence are the idea of individual rights, the practice of local self-government, and the Christian religion. On individual rights, Tocqueville writes that Americans, quote, have taken from the English aristocracy the idea of individual rights, unquote. The claim that individual rights are not a democratic idea follows necessarily from Tocqueville's equation of democracy with majority rule. For Tocqueville, the real founding of America was in Puritan Massachusetts, as he tells us in the second chapter of his book. For that to be true, however, we would have to see a basic continuity between early Puritanism and the founding. It is true that the Puritans had local self-government, but they had no individual rights. Furthermore, the Puritan conception of government was very different from that of the founders. Their idea was, to quote John Winthrop, quote, "The purpose of political life is to serve the Lord and work out our salvation under the power and purity of his holy ordinances," unquote. The founders, in contrast, started from the idea that all men are born equally free and independent. From this, it follows that individuals have natural rights. For example, no one may violate the life or liberty of another. And it follows that the only legitimate source of the rule of one person over another must be consent. For the founders, the idea of individual rights and the idea of majority rule are two sides of the same coin. Far from being an aristocratic heritage, individual rights for the founders are rooted in the equal natural liberty of each person. For the founders, government derives its purpose from these basic ideas. That is, its purpose is to secure the life and liberty that each person possesses by nature, but which are endangered from the violence of others. The founders, in sum, defended democracy and understood democracy, not merely in terms of majority rule, but in terms of a coherent theory of right, in which majority rule was tempered by the rights of the individual and of the minority. In short, democracy, from the point of view of the founders, is not a not an amalgam of disparate elements formed by chance. On religion, the second element that Tocqueville mentions as having a non-democratic source, he says, quote, religion is a precious heritage from aristocratic times, unquote. So again, it's an aristocratic thing in its origin. For Tocqueville, religion has no necessary connection with the idea of majority rule, but by a happy accident, America was able to blend the amoral spirit of liberty, meaning majority rule, with the moral spirit of religion, Christianity. Thus, democracy is able to find in religion the moral guide that it would otherwise have lacked. Now, the actual relation between religion and democracy in America, I would argue, is more complicated than that. American statesmen have long been appreciative of the support provided by religion for the moral principles of American politics. But they made a distinction between religious support for these principles and the principles themselves, which they thought, that is, earlier Americans thought, were evident in human nature and therefore inseparable from the theory of democracy itself. Lincoln once remarked that the idea of equality is, quote, the father of all moral principle in us. Lincoln meant that the principles of the founding are themselves moral principles. They contain within themselves the idea of both of majority rule and of majority restraint. The individual right to liberty is the source of both majority rule and minority rights. If majority rule is right, slavery is wrong, Lincoln thought. For the founders and Lincoln, Christianity agrees with this claim, this truth, but Christianity can also be, but the truth in question can be known by reason alone. Jefferson wrote, again, in summing up this combination of the idea of majority will with minority rights, all will bear in mind the sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable. The minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate which would be oppression. A third historical accident that made American democracy successful, according to Tocqueville, was the tradition of local self-government. I agree, this tradition was very important. Tocqueville argues that the logic of democratic ideas, however, is hostile to local liberty. Democratic peoples, he says, prefer centralized, uniform government. Thus, local liberty, in his argument, will always be threatened in democratic times. I would argue, on the contrary, that local self-government was extremely difficult to uproot in America, not only because it was old and customary, as Tocqueville would have emphasized, but because it was closely connected in the minds of Americans with the principles of 1776. In a footnote in which he criticizes my own essay on Tocqueville, Ray says that my excessive emphasis on the principles of the Declaration implies that, quote, their colonial heritage of self-government ceased to matter to Americans on July 4, 1776, unquote. Ray's remark suggests that the more people are devoted to the abstract idea of equality, the less they will care about local self-government. And I think that may be what Tocqueville is suggesting himself. But Jefferson, for one, explicitly tied the principles of the founding to local government. How can a people remain free if they have no opportunity to be involved in their own government close to home? It is precisely the principle of equality that leads to the importance of local government, while it is the rejection of that principle that led the progressives to repudiate small-town America. In sum, the founders' America was not an amalgam of perfectly distinct elements, as Tocqueville argues, but a regime and a way of life informed by a coherent argument, an argument that affirmed majority rule and minority and moral limits on the majority. Here is a powerful resource for advocates today of limited government and responsible liberty. Thank you.
Well, I think we've, through these three fine talks, we have much fertile ground for discussion. So I think we should go straight to questions and answers. We have a microphone, so please wait for the microphone to reach you and identify who you are and your affiliation before asking your question. Thanks.
Julia Shaw, the Heritage Foundation. This question is specifically for Professor Ray, but I'd like all the panelists to answer. You mentioned that the administrative state keeps expanding and expanding and expanding, and you made reference that Tocqueville should be our guide to, it seems, returning back to constitutional government. How do you see Tocqueville as leading a path back to limited constitutional government, or is there another author or something that we should look for?
I don't know of any other author who can provide us with that kind of guidance other than Tocqueville. Tom West, in his remarks, suggested that in my book I derive our current difficulties from the progressives, and I certainly spend a fair amount of time on the progressives. But it isn't a matter of high intellectual history that brought us here. It isn't the fact that the professors went astray in the 1870s and the 1880s. What's interesting is the fact that they did go astray despite the fact that they were well informed concerning the natural rights theories underpinning the American founding. There's something deeper at work, and it's Tocqueville who identifies that deep source that led those professors to embrace Rousseau by way of Hegel, and far more important, that led the American people sort of step by step, slowly, and to a considerable degree unawares, to throw themselves into the laps of the successors of those professors at times of tension and crisis in American life. That's why I think Tocqueville's analysis of the political psychology of the democratic tide is crucial. That is to say that in conditions of equality, we have a tendency to find ourselves alone, to think ourselves weak. And he saw that in America there were institutional and social resources, some of them inherited from the past and some of them crafted after the American founding. After all, he talks a great deal about the Federalist, that would enable us to resist. Those are being deconstructed, and I think in a self-conscious way deconstructed. Let me just take one example. There's a proposal now that there be no tax deduction for charitable gifts for Americans. If you think about that, that's a direct attack on civic associations. And if you look at the stimulus bill, it includes a lot of money for charities. So what will happen is charities will continue to exist, but they will be guided by the federal government because it will provide the money, and you'll cut off private sources of money. The autonomy of civic agency will disappear. So what could we do about this? What in a practical way could we do? I've given some thought to this since I finished the book, because I finished the book before the election. I added a couple paragraphs after the election because there was a little bit of space, but there wasn't an opportunity to add more. And we are in a more dangerous situation now than we were last October. What could we do? I think there is something that we could do that would be concrete and important, and that is a constitutional amendment. Not to come from Congress, because it would never support such a constitutional amendment, but to come from the states, from the state legislatures, that would make unfunded and partially funded mandates unconstitutional, that would take away from the federal government the capacity to dictate to our state governments by offering them bribes. it would leave intact the power of the federal government to fully fund something and offer that to the states. But it would remove from the federal government the possibility of funding highways on condition you rearrange your school systems in a certain way. Some way of forcing the federal government back out of areas that it doesn't fully provide for would be a beginning. And even more important than an institutional change through a constitutional amendment would be the process by which the constitutional amendment was adopted. The final reliance of a liberal democracy is upon the spirit of the people. And if the spirit is one of passive acceptance of everything that comes from Washington, we're lost no matter what parchment barriers stand in the way. After all, who would trust the United States Supreme Court to defend our rights? But if Americans all across the country rally in defense of local autonomy through the activity of their state legislatures, in other words, if you build a national movement on this, that national movement can be an occasion for Americans relearning their heritage of limited government and of federalism. So we need institutional changes, but institutional changes are not enough. Democracy doesn't simply operate institutionally. It operates upon the basis of the spirit of the people as well, and that is, if anything, more important than the institutions themselves. And so we need something that moves us back, consistent with the Declaration of Independence, consistent with the original Constitution, consistent with the Federalists, but responsive to what Tocqueville understood about the political psychology of the longing for security, that the inquietude that is typical of human beings in a social democratic state, that is responsive to that and understands the need to overcome that. One more word. I emphasized just briefly the Tea Parties the other day. It's exactly that is important in American life. Civic agency. Don't tread on me. The activity of people in their localities to defend their natural rights. If people aren't willing to turn out and defend their natural rights, if they're not willing to get involved in political activity that would lead to the kind of transformation I'm talking about, we will continue to drift. But let me repeat at the end of this. I do not believe that our despotic drift can be explained simply in terms of the political science of the Federalist. We absolutely need Tocqueville to understand why it was that those professors in the university who went off the track gradually attracted more and more support.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on the question of regime change. The question you're raising, Julia, is what could change our regime in a different direction from where it's going. I think that there's a lesson to be learned here from Plato, Republic, Book 8. He's discussing the subject of regime change there and what leads to regime change from within. His basic argument is regime change from within always takes place for the same reason. People who are out of power, who have spiritedness, want to be in power, and they figure out a way to get power. Now, when he's discussing why democracy was overthrown, Plato Socrates says it happens when a group of people, which he calls drones, come along and say, I'll give you people exactly what you want. I'm here to share the wealth. Those rich people are really mean and bad. And so if you put me in power, I'll help you. But Socrates is saying, these people don't believe in democracy. They hate democracy. They want to overthrow it. the people left to themselves, says Socrates, are happy to just go to work and come home and be dutiful citizens and let the rich be rich, too. So my point is regime change takes place when people who are spirited, who have spiritedness, who are smart and who want power, get angry and upset. They can lead the people. Right now, I think that's a real problem. There's a really significant problem in the leadership of those who supposedly want to resist the contemporary trends. And that's why I was emphasizing in my talk the importance of understanding the principled foundation of the American regime. What is it that would lead young people who have spirit to want to make America a different sort of place? There has to be there has to be an idea that they can adopt that they would feel strongly about and be willing to act. And it seems to me right now in our intellectual discourse that those ideas of that type are hard to find. I put much less trust, I think, than Paul does in the ability of the people themselves to initiate regime change. The Tea Party phenomenon is an expression of anger, but I would say probably won't have any effect unless some leaders come along to articulate a way of understanding American life that might lead people to support them and put them in power.
I agree with everything Tom said, and I would suggest that the leaders are likely to come from the state governments.
Professor Caesar, anything to add? No? Okay, any more questions?
Word AEI. Let me do two rants that I'll attach question marks to for the whole panel, but starting with you, Paul. First, your comment about the proposal right now to reduce the charitable deduction for charities. I agree completely the insidious effect of that. On the other hand, remember that when Tocqueville is, I don't need to remind you, know this, when Tocqueville's writing about voluntary association, he's writing at a time when there is no income tax, right? So they do not depend upon the incentive of an income tax deduction for their livelihood. And
not much taxes at all, actually.
Exactly. And it's just a thought experiment. I wonder if we actually completely abolish the, the proposal, strictly speaking, is to reduce it, not eliminate it, I think, unless it's changed and I haven't missed something. But even if we eliminated it, it strikes me that what we might see, I could be wrong about this, is we might see that a lot of charities that we might think in this room are sort of the frivolous playground of the liberal rich, museums of modern art, would probably actually be hurt more by changing the incentives to donate money than, say, our churches. In other words, a lot of the voluntary associations that Tocqueville pointed to that are still vibrant today, I think might carry on just as well as always because people are committed to them for their intrinsic worth and not for the tax benefit they get at the end of the year. I don't know. But I'd want to think about that one a little bit more. I think you're right. I think the purpose of this is to make our charitable sector more like the European sector. But my bigger question is this one. The description you talked about the way federalism has been eroded and your proposal to try and bring it back with a constitutional amendment, that's one half of the problem with the progressive administrative state. The other half is the centralized bureaucracy here in Washington that works through such things as, to pick one example and see if you can work with this, the FDA, which is now 103 years old. And on the one hand, you may or may not be familiar with the literature on how the FDA does all kinds of things wrong. The perverse incentives and the high costs and all the rest of that, and that's all quite right. On the other hand, what is the alternative to something like the FDA? We wouldn't really want Congress voting on drug approvals, would we? I don't think we would. The libertarian idea might be common law on steroids. There's been some reasonably serious thought on that. What is the alternative that we would propose now for that kind of problem? Does it require, rethinking the police power in a more rigorous way, or what? Any of you have any kind of answer to that kind of problem? Or if you don't like that example, pick another one. The EPA, which distracts me in most of my waking hours.
tax deductions. I'm not sure the liberal rich give any money to anything. Look at Joe Biden's. People have done studies on this, and conservatives are actually much more generous than liberals. So I think it's aimed at us for what that's worth. On the administrative state, much of it I'd simply like to get rid of. Department of Education, for example, seems to me to have no justification for its existence. I don't think the Department of Agriculture any longer has any justification for its existence. Food and Drug Administration, that's an interesting question. You're talking about interstate commerce because nearly everything of that sort crosses state lines. It's a proper area for regulation, and safety regulations aren't a bad thing. The problem comes when you've got the rule-making power, the execution of the rules, and then the judging about whether the rules have been broken, all inside the same agency, in which case everything takes place in private. I mean, you look at what Tim Geithner is doing. I mean, the American economy is being rearranged, and it's all secret. We can't even discuss it. We're not allowed to know anything about it. You can imagine that being legitimate with regard to our spies in China. Don't want that in the newspaper, but why can't we know about? That would be the newspaper. Right. In cases like the FDA, in detail, I don't really know how to cope with that particular one. One thing would be to move the judicial aspect of it out of the agency altogether, and to make the legislature have to approve the rules. Every so often there's executive provides a proposal. Then there can actually be hearings that are public hearings, and there can be congressmen and senators who get themselves into trouble for what goes on. Right now, what we've got is a situation where the people we elect don't have to take responsibility for 90% of what the government does. And the president doesn't either, because it's done by some agency that is opaque. That strikes me as very dangerous. Montesquieu, whom the Founding Fathers looked to, as much as Tocqueville looked to him, said that the combination of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial powers is the very definition of tyranny. And it seems to me that that's the case. I mean, perhaps these powers are for the most part responsibly used, but think about the possibilities for favoritism when everything goes on behind the scenes. And favoritism to one is the destruction of another. It could be that we're looking forward to a government whose model you can find in Chicago.
Any other additions from the panelists?
Well, I'd like to just add, in the case of the FDA, I admit is a harder call, but EPA, there's a lot of things the EPA does that have nothing to do with national problems. It's just local things. They just think they know better than Dallas how we should deal with our local air pollution issue. And it seems like one of the things that would be rather easy would be to say that people in local communities ought to deal with local problems. And, for example, we're being told we have to build HOV lanes at great expense. And I don't see who that's helping other than a bunch of contractors who, like HOV lanes because it costs more to build highways. And you could say the same thing in regard to wetlands. I mean, why is that a federal issue? Whether some place on my campus, for example, we have to get mitigation statements for building a new dorm on my campus because there might be this little puddle that exists out in the woods might get affected by something. So it seems, practically speaking, there are lots of things that could be done. But my point is, I think the big problem is that the way people think about these questions is there's just this general presumption that these experts at the center know best. And as long as that assumption prevails, all you're going to be able to get is minor adjustments. If you can challenge that presumption, and of course the model here is the kind of thing Reagan used to do, where he'd tell stories. He was great at picking out newspaper stories about all these various abuses that take place when federal agencies are out of control, which they mostly are in regard to all kinds of local things and individual cases. the horror stories helped to make people conscious of the need to change and to make it appealing. And his idea was like get people thinking again of the idea of local power, individual responsibility, and the notion that these experts that we trust so much really either don't know what they're doing as much as they say they do, or have actual self-interested motives that makes them not want to do their jobs properly. So I think in that broader sense, that's why I think the idea of getting people to understand the broad idea, the purposes of government, might have a longer-term effect, big effect, on some of these very specific concerns that you're bringing up quite rightly.
Now we have many questions. Why don't we start here?
I was wondering if you can make some comments more about the theory of democracy, especially. Mark Naterno, I'm with the Interactivity Foundation, and I'm wondering if you can, both Dr. Wright and Dr. West and Dr. Caesar, if you could make some comments about the theory of democracy, especially as the founders thought of it, because I've always been struck by the prevalence of supermajority votes or requirements for supermajority votes for some of our most important decisions, which is, it seems to me that it's not simply to ensure that the rights of the minorities are not trampled upon, but rather to ensure that minority views will prevail in very many circumstances over majority views. And so the notion that democracy in America is somehow the idea of majority rule seems to me to miss something real big about what's going on with our Constitution, let alone procedures within Congress.
Well, the idea is of majority rule within a limited government. And so the very idea of limited government means some sort of restraints upon the majority. And those restraints, in the most obvious way, are provided by a constitution and provided by courts that can enforce the Constitution as law. That very provision indicates that the understanding is that there be majority rule, but within limited contexts. And so, for example, with the 10th Amendment, which is consistent with the original notion of the Constitution, I think, you've got the notion that there's certain things the federal government simply cannot do, and that are left to the state governments. But when you turn to the state governments, they have constitutions too that limit what they can do. If you move away from the idea of a constitution, which we have done, somewhere I was wandering around Washington yesterday and I saw the First Amendment up there, and it says, Congress shall make no law. But McCain-Feingold is a law. Shall make no law. It couldn't be clearer that in areas of freedom of the speech and freedom of the press, Congress has no right to do anything. So when you don't have courts that will enforce those rules, and when you can't rally the American people to breaches of those rules, then you've really got trouble. In other words, these parchment barriers are very important, but in some ways they're more important by laying out principles for the American people, rallying points. And another thing conservatives could do in the direction of restoring constitutional government in this country is to call for repeal of McCain-Feingold on the basis that it is unconstitutional. George Bush understood that it was unconstitutional, and he broke his oath of office when he signed it, because he thought, I can punt and not take the political fire for this, and the Supreme Court will take care of it. With presidents like that, we're lost.
Okay, let me make a comment about the theory of the founding, theory of democracy and founding. I think the reason why they sometimes seem undemocratic is because the basic idea of how to think about government contains within itself two principles that are in potential tension with each other. One is the idea government ought to be based on the consent of the governed, because no one has the right to rule anyone by nature. There's no right to rule. So it has to come from acceptance, voluntary. But on the other side, Government exists for a purpose. It's to secure these rights, meaning the individual rights of every person. What if the people consent to rules and laws that don't do that? That's the basic problem of the founding, that they wrestled with for 20 years, and then we're still wrestling with. What do you do when the people consent to things that aren't actually in the service of what government's supposed to do? So they came up with the idea of lots of ideas to try to make it more likely that government would in fact make good policies that would secure the rights of the people. And that partly involved these temporary checks or supermajority provisions or whatever that in some respects do slightly in some ways qualify the will of the majority. The idea, though, was overall and in the long run, the people's will should prevail, even if in some short-term situation not. Now, let me just say something about what it is the founders thought you had to do to secure the rights of the people. This is something I think we're very unfamiliar with today. The question of how you do that. So first of all, in foreign policy, that means you do it through defense. You do it by having significant armed forces, which requires wealth and population. Right? So those become factors in how do you do policy. Right? You want to make sure you have enough people. You want to make sure your economy is productive enough to pay for the weapons. In domestic policy, the primary way government protects your rights is through the criminal law, by arresting and prosecuting people who harm people's lives, liberties, and properties. We don't usually think of it that way, but it is. That's how government protects your rights. Feds don't have anything to do with that in principle. That was a state government thing. And the civil law equally is meant to serve that end, right? So, for example, the civil law is supposed to define how do you know when you own property? What are the rules of exchanging it? Contract law. And under what conditions can you sue people? Tort. Family law. Who's allowed to get married? Under what conditions are children supposed to be generated? Should the government discourage sex outside of marriage? The founders thought all those things were also implications of their basic idea of what government is there for. You can't protect the rights of the people if you have too large a percentage of citizens being raised by one parent or no parents. How are these kids going to learn the idea of citizenship and responsibility? You need families. So that becomes an actual policy of government that follows from the notion of government being there to protect your rights. So you have this whole complex. My point is you have this whole complex of policies and that follow from the idea of the principles of the founding that we have tended to not notice. We tend to think, it's just that slavery is bad and everything else is sort of, you can do whatever you want beyond that as long as there's no slavery. So, the Civil War solved that, so we're okay. In 20th century administrative states, not a problem. I mean, a lot of people really think there is no conflict between where we are now and the principles of the founding. But, just one last point on that, on this whole civil law question, their idea was you have to have free markets if you're going to have a society in which people have the right to acquire and possess property. If people are poor, they need to have a way to get something. And if you put property in the hands of the rich and don't make it possible for the poor to use their talents to get income, that means you haven't fulfilled the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which is to secure these rights. So a free market society actually follows from this idea. Now, of course, there are all kinds of limits you can put on that, regulations, how do you prevent harm, what do you do about dangerous drugs, for sure. There can be limits, but the general framework that I'm stating here, I think, does follow from these basic principles. And that's hard. It's very hard to do that. The founders understood that. And that's why it's extremely difficult to reconcile majority rule with all the policies you need to make sure that the rights are secured.
Look, one of the reasons Tocqueville's important is because he elaborates a political science that includes an understanding of the importance of marriage, an understanding of the importance of religion, an understanding of the importance of civic associations and of local self-government and how they fit together. Crudely put, from Tocqueville one can draw this lesson. A libertarian who is not a moral conservative doesn't understand the principles of liberty. And a moral conservative who isn't a libertarian doesn't understand the implications of moral conservatism. A Roman Catholic bishop who's in favor of the family should think twice about Social Security, because Social Security undermines the family by removing one of the motives for having children. A Roman Catholic bishop who is in favor of strong families should have doubts about daycare, because what daycare says to mothers is you don't need husbands. Similarly, libertarians who lean in the direction of libertinism lean in the direction of producing citizens who are going to be desperately alone as they grow older and are going to look to governments to provide for them. These things all fit together neatly, and that has been forgotten by many people who think of themselves as conservatives.
Here in the back.
My name is David Azuad. I'm with the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, and as a disclaimer, Dr. West is my dissertation advisor. I have a question for Paul Ray. How would you begin to answer Dr. West's charge that Tocqueville didn't get the founding?
Right. Let me start by pointing to a contradiction in Dr. West's remarks. Early on, he said that Tocqueville misunderstands the founding. He's silent on the Declaration of Independence in a book on the American founding. Later, he agrees with me that it's not a book about America at all. If it was a book about the American founding, if it was a book really about America, then a silence on the Declaration of Independence would indeed be odd. But if it's a book of political science about democracy, focused mainly on France, with an eye to American institutions and American practices, as they might be useful to the French, then his silence on that particular subject is utterly meaningless and of no significance whatsoever. It's not that he concealed the natural rights founding, as Dr. West suggested was a possibility, or disagreed with it. It's that he didn't need to talk about it. Once again, I point you to the Federalist, which has no mention, no explicit mention of the Declaration of Independence. And I have read historians who take the Federalist as an example, proving the insignificance of the Declaration of Independence. It is as absurd to do what they do, to use it as evidence for that, as it is to use the silence of Tocqueville on this question as evidence for his rejection of it. In fact, he takes it for granted. And he applies it in the case of slavery. He's the man actually who is responsible, personally responsible, for the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. And the argument that he makes under the Second Republic is an appeal to natural rights. When he talks about religion, what he's interested in is how people came to recognize that they have natural rights. Both Tocqueville and the American founders look back to Montesquieu. Both of them emphasize mores and manners, history and tradition. If you look at the opening pages of the Federalist, particularly Federalist number 1, you will see nearly all of the themes that are supposed to make Tocqueville different from the Americans in his orientation. In other words, an appreciation for the peculiar history that made this a very good site for establishing a regime of natural rights and limited government. Tocqueville, writing for the French, wants to talk about that particular history. If he were a scholar, completely detached from a political purpose, which he wasn't, writing an account of the American founding, then yes, there'd be a point to the silences. If, on the other hand, what he's trying to do is to explain to the French why it works in America and why where the The general will is meant to embody eternal truths, the way Rousseau uses the term. Now, Tocqueville doesn't use the term general will, and though he is attentive to Rousseau and responds to Rousseau on this question of political psychology, that is to say, on the question of inquietude, and very attentive to him in that particular, Tocqueville looks to the same foundations that the American founders looked to.
Response?
Well, I'd let Tom respond. This reading of the book, of course, would make it a book primarily for the French and not a general book of democracy that would speak fully to America. So I know that Tom has made that point. Are we to accept it as a book that's instructive for America as well? Now, one possibility is yours, Paul, which is that it was mostly for a European audience and not for an American, and that explains the silence on the Declaration. Another reason would be that he intended this silence more generally also for America. So this would, I think, join Tom's point, because there was this, certainly let's begin with France before we get to America, but there is this question generally raised by one strand of conservatives of, is it helpful in human affairs to proclaim general doctrines of right as a way of achieving right in society? Or is the natural effect of these doctrines, especially, say, this doctrine, the Lockean Doctrine, does it in the long run serve to undermine liberty? Most doctrines of abstract right, the history of them, haven't done so well. Beginning with the French case, this became an occasion for a greater acquisition of central power rather than a limitation of central power. I'm only repeating the arguments of Burke, with whom Tocqueville was very acquainted. So there's one possibility then that he just was seeking to avoid this in France, where no sane person wanted to repeat the idea of general rights, given the effects that the proclamation of general rights had on Europe. Another possibility is that there's a deeper point, that there's a problem with abstract proclamations of general rights, and that this isn't the best or the only way to understand how societies are put together, and can in fact be dangerous. So, taking nothing away from the Declaration, how far can the American polity be set up just on the basis of ideas from the Declaration? This would be, I think, a challenge to America as well, that the book was actually intended, partly in its silence, maybe to America. At the time, perhaps Locke was understood incorrectly. This would be a historical point, but there was a massive movement against Lockeanism at the time that Tocqueville was writing, including many of the people that he met with and spoke with in the United States, on the basis of the anthropology which all understood or thought they understood to underlie Locke, namely a fully materialist understanding, which did call into question religion, religiosity, and which did call into question a concern for tradition. Because after all, if you can figure it out from a state of nature, what do you need tradition for? So I think there's a deeper conservative argument that Tocqueville's making. And the final point would be, to what extent does Tocqueville want to embrace the a notion of founding, that societies are founded at one point? Because I think, as Thomas pointed out, this attack on the Declaration, or the silence about the Declaration, let's put it that way, introduces another understanding of founding. Instead of founding being that which took place just in 1776 and 1787, you have a diminution in democracy in America of founding, and a replacement of the idea of founding with growth and evolution of institutions. So this could be this question: to what extent is it better for free societies to be based on ideas of pure founding, which opens the way to rational administration and control? Because, boy, if you can found, why can't you found a rational state? This opens the door to this idea of conservatism, I think, which was Tocqueville wanted to introduce. So I think there's a teaching there. the final question would be whether this teaching, once introduced, and I think there's something to be said for it, needs some correction in its own right. That's, I think, been Tom's crusade over the years. I think there's something to be said for this Tom's correction, especially in light of our own tradition and history. I would conclude, you mentioned the point about slavery, that Tocqueville probably would have rewritten democracy in America after the Civil War in a different way, and that founding would have reappeared in a more robust light, and certainly the Declaration might have appeared in a more robust light. So, well, it's a long, complicated question, but trying to put something into Tocqueville's answer other than just ignoring what was going on in the United States.
I appreciate these comments a lot. I think there's much to be said here. I mean, on behalf of what we've just heard, I would want to raise the question of what then would be the advantages of an appeal to abstract right, given the concerns that Tocqueville implicitly has and that Jim Caesar explicitly stated. And it does seem to me that, as Jim implied at the end, that the appeal to abstract right can, in fact, be very useful in certain political circumstances. Obviously, it was something that was a key element in Lincoln's arsenal when he tried to rally the nation to oppose the indefinite expansion of slavery, because as he saw, the principle on which that expansion was being defended was the idea that the majority can do whatever it wants to. If you take Douglas's explanation, or in the South, the idea that there's a master race that deserves to rule, or even, as we later found out, exterminate other races. Now, and so that was helpful. I've also noticed in today's world, if you look at the current Supreme Court and you say, who are the originalists there? Well, Scalia and Thomas. And it turns out that actually Thomas is probably a little more enthusiastic about originalism than Scalia is. And, I mean, there are numerous cases in which Thomas argues things like, well, there's no constitutional right to a law library under the Eighth Amendment, or things like that, and Scalia won't sign the opinion. But why would that be? I think it has something to do with, as Thomas himself will say, what he came to believe in the 1980s when he was back at the EEOC talking to people like Ken Masugi and John Marini, that there's really something good about the Constitution. It's based on the principles that are right and eternally true. And that seems to have helped Thomas to be more respectful of the Constitution than most originalists today actually are. That this doctrine, this abstract doctrine, seems to be able to help persuade people to really to believe more strongly in the rightness of their nation. I think it's especially difficult for intellectuals to believe in democracy. The very idea of being an intellectual is, I'm better than everybody else. I've got a PhD and you don't. And it seems to me one of the useful features of the Lockean doctrine is that it appeals to intellectuals as, okay, this is something we've figured out, but it means that we also have to restrain ourselves for the public good, really ultimately for our own good, because intellectuals have an interest too in not being oppressed.
The difficulty, though, is you open the idea up to rights and look at how most people interpret rights. I mean, this is the issue. You have your understanding of rights and what you take to be the correct understanding, the American understanding. But you look at most judicial interpretations of rights in the world, and you get the exact opposite of Lockeanism. So this is the problem, that has to be said in favor of Tocqueville's concern. Where you open something up to the claim that an abstract doctrine can include everything and set the one theory of government, you therefore open yourself up to the wrong interpretation of that, or a false interpretation of that, which institutionally is going to apply more often than not. So this was the fact. Most Enlightenment ideas of rights over the course of human affairs have been disasters. Natural rights was the source of tyranny, not of freedom. In the world. I mean, Hobbes is an example. It's a justification of tyranny. So it was never on the side of liberty. The side of liberty up until maybe the American Declaration of Rights, the side of liberty was against these abstract ideas for fear of that it opened it up to what was called enlightened despotism, which is the marriage of strong government to philosophy. So it becomes a very complicated problem, and I think a problem that only is going to be understood in part by prudence. I think there's actually a statesmanly understanding of when to use doctrines of right and when not. And Tocqueville, I believe, made a judgment. This, I guess, disagree a little bit with Paul. I think he did make a judgment for America. And I agree with Tom that his judgment would have to have been revised subsequent to the mistake of the Whigs, the group he was closest to, who didn't have a way to oppose slavery. He would have revised it. And after all, if you rely on tradition, how can you have a tradition in the United States post-Civil War which would deny the existence of your most important president? You'd have to take that into account. You'd write a history which would be so strangely deficient if you tried to say that there was no role for abstract rights in American politics as to be completely irrelevant. So there's something to be said when I look at how judges continually use rights in ways that are the greatest source in the world for the obliteration of rights. It puts me in one mind, including United Nations declarations of rights. So if everyone thought like Tom, we'd be in good shape, but they don't.
Last word for Paul.
Let me add something to this, because I think Jim Caesar's probably right. Certainly with regard to France, Tocqueville and his family had witnessed a rupture. His parents came within 3 days of being executed under Robespierre. His grandparents and his great-grandparents were executed, including the great Malesherbes. Rupture's not something that he's very friendly to. Though when he writes about the French Revolution, he thrills to it. So it's a little complicated. What's interesting is when he leads the campaign against slavery, he has recourse to abstract natural rights. He returns to those themes because that is the argument that is there to be made. In that sense, it seems to me that he is very close to Montesquieu, who is on prudential grounds suspicious of Lockeanism, because what he fears is it will lead to a great rupture in France and to tyranny. But when he comes to talk about slavery, when Montesquieu comes, he also turns to the question of abstract natural rights. So it is a kind of tempered Lockeanism that you find in Montesquieu, tempered by the fear of the possible outcome. And I think the same thing is true with Tocqueville.
Well, one last comment. If the idea of rights, abstract rights, is tied to nature and natural law, which it was in the founding, that means to obligation, to moral duty, and to nature, meaning to human nature as it is, the rights you have by nature are the things you possess by nature, your life and your liberty. If it's understood that way, it can't be expanded into universal health care and all the rest. But once you cut yourself off from nature and turn to history or evolving concepts of human dignity and where we are today, then of course. So I would say yes, abstract rights, but definitely tied to human nature, can, I think, be a stable foundation for
the trouble is,
sensible
in
politics.
the French Revolution,